57 houses. I counted every single one they built on my stolen land, and I let them finish every last roof tile. The rumble of bulldozers started before dawn, massive yellow machines tearing through pastures where 4 generations of Whitmores raised cattle. House after house sprouting like expensive weeds, the smell of diesel exhaust and fresh concrete choking out a century of family history. Vivian Ashford Cross stood there every morning in her white Tesla, directing her crews with that clipboard like some suburban Napoleon. This HOA president had stolen my 340-acre ranch through backroom county deals while I was burying my parents. She spotted me watching from my porch and actually waved, shouting,
"Thanks for being so reasonable about progress."
Everyone thought I'd given up. My sister, my lawyer, even the sheriff felt sorry for the broken old rancher watching strangers build dreams on his grandfather's grave. But I wasn't broken. I was patient. Because I still controlled the 80-year-old dam upstream, and timing is everything. What would you do? Drop your location below. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a rancher played the long game against suburban corruption. 6 months earlier, this war began with a knock on my door and the smell of expensive perfume cutting through morning air thick with cattle dust and honest sweat. The Whitmore Ranch, 340 acres of Colorado high country where 4 generations learned that land doesn't belong to you. You belong to it. My great-grandfather homesteaded in 1889. My grandfather built the federal dam in 1943, part of an Army Corps flood control project that saved Denver from spring flooding for 80 years. The smell of wet concrete and machine oil still clung to the spillway on humid mornings, like ghosts of government handshakes. My parents expanded the cattle operation until black ice took them on Highway 34 in January 2023. The taste of grief and black coffee became my breakfast ritual. 5:30 a.m. on the porch, watching sunrise paint the Rockies, while steam rose from my mug like prayers for strength I didn't have. That left me and my sister Della with more land than money, and a dam system older than NASA. Della's a school teacher, 47, divorced, practical as a socket wrench with mom's common sense and dad's Norwegian stubbornness. The kind of woman who could talk sense into a brick wall if it was being unreasonable. Enter the villain. Vivian Ashford Cross moved to Pine Ridge Falls in December 2022, trailing corruption like perfume. 49, former Denver corporate lawyer with highlighted hair that cost more than my truck payment and a white Tesla that purred like a satisfied predator. She became HOA president of adjacent Sunset Meadows before her moving boxes hit the recycling bin, which should have been our first clue that democracy was already dead. February. Vivian starts haunting county meetings like a well-dressed vulture. 3rd meeting, she stands up during public comment with a presentation slicker than a Denver oil executive's promises. Commissioners, I'm here to discuss an environmental emergency. That honey voice could make cancer sound like a vacation opportunity. She had charts showing soil contamination that would have made Chernobyl jealous. Photos of our ranch that looked like a Mad Max movie set. According to her independent analysis, and I use that term like lawyers use justice, our cattle were poisoning the watershed. Our century-old pastures were eroding into Willow Creek. Our family's ranching practices threatened 23,000 innocent residents. Commissioner Blake Torrance nodded along like his head was spring-loaded. Funny how a man can develop environmental consciousness right after his golf handicap improves, courtesy of free lessons from Vivian's husband Preston. Emergency rezoning, Vivian declared, for community safety. Emergency meant 48 hours, no public comment, no chance for the people getting screwed to even show up with lawyers. Emergency zoning bypasses normal due process requirements, but it requires documented immediate threat to public safety. Always demand to see the actual evidence. Most emergency claims are manufactured. March 1st. Certified mail with the cheerful subject boundary dispute resolution, like calling the Titanic a swimming pool maintenance issue. Next morning, Vivian arrived with surveyors, legal papers, and a sheriff's deputy who looked like he'd rather be fishing. I walked down from the house, boots crunching gravel that had heard 4 generations of Whitmore decisions. The diesel stench from surveying equipment mixed with her perfume smelled like progress, expensive and toxic. "Mr. Whitmore," she called, clipboard raised like a battle standard. "I hope we can handle this like civilized adults." The morning air carried the sound of cattle lowing and bulldozers warming up just over the property line. Someone had been very confident about this conversation's outcome. "Ma'am," I said, touching my hat, "what exactly are we handling?" "Your family's had a good run. steel wrapped in honey. But progress requires sacrifice. This land serves the greater community good now. Progress? My grandfather's calm settled over me like winter fog. Or theft with a college education. Her smile could have frozen coffee. I'd hate for this to become unpleasant, Mr. Whitmore. Eminent domain is such an ugly word. March 15th. The war officially started at dawn with the growl of diesel engines and the crunch of dreams under bulldozer treads. I was sipping my first coffee when the yellow monsters rolled past my kitchen window like mechanized locusts. 5 bulldozers, 2 excavators, and a crew of workers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on God's green earth. The smell of diesel exhaust mixed with morning dew created a cocktail that tasted like the death of everything my family had built. Vivian stood beside her Tesla in what I can only describe as a supervisor of destruction outfit. Hard hat that had never seen actual work, designer jeans that cost more than my monthly feed bill, and boots so clean they could have doubled as mirrors for checking lipstick. She directed traffic with her clipboard like Napoleon planning the invasion of Russia, except Napoleon probably had better people skills. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," she called, actually waving at me through my own kitchen window. "Thanks for being so reasonable about progress." The sheer audacity. I had to admire it, like admiring a rattlesnake's efficiency right before it bites you. Her workers had been given special instructions, I found this out later from an equipment operator with a guilty conscience, to wave at me every morning. Psychological warfare, suburban style. Nothing quite breaks a man's spirit like cheerful greetings from people stealing his birthright with union-approved enthusiasm. The local sheriff, Deputy Marshal Kane, showed up around 10 a.m. wearing the expression of a man who'd lost a poker game to the devil. Kane's good people, the kind of cop who became a cop to help folks, not to facilitate legal theft with a badge. We'd chatted cattle prices during a speeding ticket once, 20 minutes beside Highway 34, talking Angus bloodlines while his cruiser collected dust. "Ezra," he said, hat in his hands like he was attending a funeral, "you know I don't like this any more than you do." "Then stop it." "Can't. County says it's a civil matter during ongoing negotiations." He spit in the dirt like the words tasted of sulfur. "My hands are tied tighter than a calf at branding." By noon, they'd torn up the pasture where my grandfather taught me to ride my first horse. The sound of topsoil being scraped away was like fingernails on the chalkboard of my soul, if my soul was made of a century and a half of family sweat. 130 years of Whitmore cattle had fertilized that ground. 4 generations of kids had learned to rope and brand in that exact spot. Now it looked like the surface of Mars after a particularly bad divorce. Wednesday's Pine Ridge Gazette delivered the next blow: local rancher blocks community development. The headline sat above my morning coffee like a judgment from people who thought food came from grocery stores by magic. Reporter Jennifer Walsh had gotten all her information from a very helpful and completely objective HOA president, naturally. According to these concerned residents, who remained anonymous for fear of retaliation from the dangerous rancher, I was a selfish obstacle blocking affordable housing and community progress. The quote that really stuck was, "It's time for the old ways to make room for the new," like feeding people and working the land was some kind of embarrassing hobby. But while Vivian played public relations games, my sister Della was doing what teachers do best: homework. She spent spring break in the courthouse basement, digging through documents that hadn't seen daylight since disco was popular. The smell of old paper and institutional mildew down there could have choked a government bureaucrat, but Della's got the persistence of a bloodhound with tenure. What she found changed everything. The original 1889 land grant documents, buried under 80 years of bureaucratic sediment, showed our property lines extended 60 feet beyond Vivian's survey claims. But that wasn't the real treasure. The water rights and dam ownership were listed as separate entities from land development rights. I remembered reading about this quirk of Colorado law in some agricultural extension newsletter years back. Water rights here follow first in time, first in right, meaning whoever used the water first keeps control forever, regardless of who buys the dirt around it. Most folks don't know this until they're already in court. That night, I called Tommy Chainlink McGrath, Dad's old Army buddy who'd become a civil engineer after trading jungle warfare for infrastructure puzzles. Tommy got his nickname from his ability to cut through any fence and his talent for seeing problems as entertainment. "Ezra," Tommy said after I explained our situation, You telling me you've got a 1943 federal dam on your property? Built by the Army Corps. Still got the original paperwork somewhere. A pause that stretched like good taffy. Son, you don't just own that water. You control it. Every drop that flows through Willow Creek goes through your dam first. The implications hit me like revelations served with a side of revenge. While Vivian was busy stealing my land, she'd forgotten about the 80-year-old elephant upstream. Those 57 houses she was building, every single one sat in the natural flood path of Willow Creek, and I held the keys to the floodgates. April brought spring rain and Vivian's next weapon, character assassination through the miracle of modern technology. The Pine Ridge Family Safety Facebook group sprouted overnight like digital poison ivy. Within 72 hours, it had 300 members, most with profile pictures that looked suspiciously like stock photos of people laughing at salads. The posts read like they'd been written by the same person armed with a thesaurus and a terminal case of fake outrage. Concerned about ranch contamination affecting our children's water supply, posted Jennifer K. from Pine Ridge. Profile picture, blonde woman who'd clearly never seen a ranch. Why won't the county protect families from environmental hazards? The comments section was a masterpiece of manufactured panic. Parents worried sick about their baby's safety. Veterans disgusted by someone blocking progress for selfish greed. One creative post claimed I'd threatened to unleash cattle stampedes on development supporters. I've got 63 head of cattle, most about as threatening as oversized dogs with self-esteem issues. But Vivian's real genius was weaponizing legitimate parental fears. She scheduled community information sessions at the Civic Center, complete with professionally printed pamphlets about agricultural runoff and groundwater contamination. The meetings packed standing room only with genuinely terrified parents fed a steady diet of environmental horror stories. We have documented evidence, Vivian announced from behind a podium like she was campaigning for protector of all children, of dangerous bacteria levels in Willow Creek directly downstream from the Whitmore operation. Charts. Water quality reports from a Denver lab. Photos making the creek look like chocolate milk after a livestock convention. The science looked legitimate because it was, just completely irrelevant. Those elevated bacteria readings came from a broken septic system 3 miles upstream. But try explaining that to scared parents armed with righteous fury and limited attention spans. The economic siege began immediately. Rusty's Diner, which had served Whitmore beef since disco was popular, suddenly hemorrhaged customers after a family safety awareness campaign. Old Pete Kowalski, who remembered when my grandfather helped fix his truck during the blizzard of '79, looked physically ill every time I walked in. The smell of guilt and desperation hung in the air thicker than bacon grease. Ezra, I'm sorry, Pete said, polishing the same coffee cup like it held the secrets of the universe. It ain't right, but I got 3 employees with kids to feed. Anderson Grain jacked my feed prices 40%, citing increased liability insurance costs. Amazing how liability suddenly got expensive right after Mrs. Anderson started receiving anonymous midnight phone calls about the environmental catastrophe she was enabling by selling grain to the dangerous rancher. My sister faced her own battlefield at Pine Ridge Elementary. Parent-teacher conferences became interrogation sessions about her brother's threatening activities. The PTA president, a Boulder transplant with more opinions than functioning brain cells, actually suggested Della's family situation might be compromising her classroom effectiveness. Perhaps, the woman said with the tone of someone offering life-saving wisdom, your brother should consider what's truly best for the children in this community. Della smiled like she was discussing weather patterns. Perhaps you should focus on your children's multiplication tables and stay in your lane, Linda. The legal system delivered the knockout punch during an emergency hearing that lasted exactly 23 minutes, just long enough for Judge Patricia Caldwell to rubber stamp Vivian's latest assault. Caldwell, who'd apparently shared more than a law school with Vivian, reviewed evidence of my escalating threatening behavior. The evidence was security footage from the construction site showing me driving past on the public road, edited to make normal ranch activities look like preparation for agricultural warfare. Me checking fence lines became suspicious surveillance. Loading hay bales became stockpiling for retaliation. Walking my dog apparently constituted psychological intimidation tactics. 500-foot restraining order. Couldn't approach the construction site, which included the section of my own property where 4 generations of Whitmores rested in the family cemetery. Visiting my parents' graves now risked arrest for violating a court order on my own land. But Della's basement archaeology was yielding treasure. Those construction permits claimed single-family residential development. But Tommy McGrath's professional consultation request revealed the truth lurking in engineering blueprints. Every building designed as luxury rental properties with commercial utilities, parking for multiple families, and amenities that would make a resort jealous. I'd dealt with enough county planning battles over barn permits to know the basic rule. Residential permits can't legally cover commercial developments. The zoning violation was massive and completely intentional. Vivienne was betting nobody would check the fine print buried in 50 pages of bureaucratic camouflage. That night, I stood on my porch watching construction lights twinkle like fallen stars across stolen pasture. The evening air carried the chemical tang of fresh concrete mixed with the earthy smell of approaching rain. Somewhere in that cocktail of progress and theft was the scent of opportunity. Vivienne thought she was playing chess while I stumbled around playing checkers. She was wrong about the game, and she was dead wrong about the player. May 1st arrived with Vivienne's most audacious performance yet, weaponizing environmental protection against the environment itself. The Colorado Department of Health inspection team rolled up in white government vans like they were investigating a nuclear meltdown instead of a cattle ranch that had operated safely since before Colorado had nuclear anything. 6 inspectors in full hazmat suits because apparently cow manure had become weapons grade, testing water that ran clearer than most politicians' motives. The lead inspector, Dr. Marcus Tatum, looked genuinely puzzled as he tested creek water clean enough to baptize babies. But his supervisor, a career bureaucrat named Williams who kept checking his phone like he was expecting orders from headquarters, seemed more interested in creating television drama than collecting actual scientific data. "We're responding to credible reports of dangerous bacterial contamination," Williams announced to Channel 7's cameras, standing beside Willow Creek like he'd discovered the source of the next plague. The morning air carried the sharp smell of government-issued disinfectant mixed with the sweet scent of bureaucratic theater. What they'd actually discovered was water so pristine you could package it and sell it to Denver yuppies for premium prices. But somehow, through what I can only describe as scientific alchemy, those 47 samples would test positive for contamination when processed at a lab owned by a subsidiary of a company whose board included one Preston Ashford Cross, devoted husband and convenient business partner. By noon, every local news station was broadcasting environmental crisis in Pine Ridge segments featuring footage of hazmat-suited officials treating my ranch like ground zero of an ecological disaster. The visuals told a story that facts couldn't contradict, at least not before the 6 o'clock news cycle moved on to the next manufactured crisis. Vivienne's afternoon press conference was Academy Award-worthy performance art. Dressed in a blue power suit that probably cost more than my truck, she stood before a Protecting Our Children's Future banner, surrounded by genuinely terrified parents who'd moved to Colorado specifically for clean air and mountain water. "This is exactly what we feared," she said, dabbing her eyes with tissue that had never seen authentic tears. "How many innocent children have been poisoned by this contamination? How long has this rancher been allowed to endanger our families?" The questions floated in the mountain air like toxic gas, designed to spread panic rather than seek truth. Parents who'd never worried about their tap water suddenly imagined their toddlers developing mysterious illnesses. Property values in surrounding areas dropped faster than a lead balloon in a hurricane. Emergency court session at 3 p.m., Judge Caldwell wielding her gavel like Thor's hammer of predetermined justice. 23 minutes of legal theater resulting in complete shutdown of all ranch operations. Couldn't move cattle, couldn't fix fences, couldn't even mow the lawn without risking contempt charges and a one-way ticket to county lockup. "The court finds immediate credible threat to public safety," Caldwell intoned without making eye contact, like she was reading someone else's script. "All agricultural activities must cease pending comprehensive environmental remediation." Environmental remediation. Government speak for, "We'll make this so expensive you'll sell your soul to make it stop." But while Vivienne orchestrated her environmental puppet show, Della had unearthed the mother lode in the courthouse basement. Buried beneath 4 decades of bureaucratic archaeology, she'd discovered my grandfather's wartime correspondence with the Army Corps of Engineers. That old dam wasn't just some farmer's irrigation hobby. Built under federal authority in 1943 as part of a flood control system protecting Denver from spring snowmelt catastrophes. The yellow documents, written in careful government precision during wartime efficiency, established federal water management jurisdiction that superseded any state, county, or local authority, like a constitutional amendment trumps city ordinances. The real treasure was buried in the technical manual, mandatory seasonal water releases during peak snowmelt periods, specifically late May, to prevent devastating downstream floods. Federal regulations required these releases regardless of local development, political preferences, or suburban sensibilities. Tommy McGrath's reaction when I read him the relevant sections was worth recording for posterity. Sweet Jesus on a motorcycle, Ezra. You're telling me these clowns built 57 houses in a federal flood control zone without notifying FEMA? That's exactly what I'm telling you, Tommy. Every house violates federal floodplain regulations. Construction insurance is void. Mortgages are probably illegal. The whole damn development could be condemned faster than you could say environmental disaster. The implications crashed over me like a spring flood. Vivian had been so focused on stealing my land through local corruption that she'd completely ignored federal authority older than her Botox appointments. Every house in Sunset Meadows sat in violation of regulations that could trigger automatic government seizure. Memorial Day weekend loomed 3 weeks away, peak snowmelt season when federal guidelines required dam operators to release excess water for downstream flood prevention. The manual specified exact dates and water levels, written by engineers who understood that nature doesn't negotiate with county commissioners or HOA presidents. Standing on my porch that evening, watching construction lights sparkle across stolen ground, I could taste opportunity mixing with mountain rain and the approaching storm of federal justice. Vivian thought environmental warfare would finish off one stubborn rancher. She'd forgotten that environmental law cuts both ways, and federal authority flows downhill like water seeking its level. May 5th, Della called with the breathless excitement of someone who just found buried treasure in their backyard, which, in a legal sense, she had. Ezra, remember Dad's mystery safety deposit box? The one we couldn't find after the funeral? I'd completely forgotten. Dad was old-school suspicious of banks, but kept one box for government papers too important for home storage. We'd searched for months, finally assuming he'd closed it during one of his periodic anti-banking crusades. Found the key taped inside his desk drawer, Della said, words tumbling over each other. You need to see this, right now. First National Bank smelled like floor wax and anxiety, that peculiar institutional blend of marble cleaner and other people's financial problems. The safety deposit box looked disappointingly ordinary, just a metal rectangle that could hold documents and maybe some jewelry. What emerged from it was worth more than my entire ranch. Original federal flood control agreement signed in Washington, D.C., March 15, 1943. Complete Army Corps of Engineers operational manual. 47 pages of technical specifications that read like constitutional law written by people who understood that water doesn't negotiate. Correspondence establishing permanent federal water management authority that would survive in perpetuity, outlasting politicians, development trends, and local corruption. The real treasure was buried on page 32, mandatory seasonal water release requirements. Every spring, during peak snowmelt conditions in late May, federal law required dam operators to release excess reservoir water, preventing catastrophic downstream flooding. The dates were specific, non-negotiable, backed by environmental regulations that could override everything from county zoning to state legislation. May 23rd through May 25th, Memorial Day weekend. Exactly when Vivian had scheduled Sunset Meadows' grand opening celebration, the moral mathematics hit me like a physical weight pressing against my chest. I could flood 57 empty houses, or watch innocent families move into federally condemned properties that FEMA would seize within months. Property destruction versus human financial devastation. Both paths led through suffering. The question was whose pain and when it would fall. That evening, Tommy McGrath spread the documents across my kitchen table like battle plans, studying technical specifications with an engineer's precision and a veteran's respect for federal authority. The smell of his black coffee mixed with the musty scent of 80-year-old paper, creating an atmosphere thick with possibility and dread. This changes everything, Ezra, Tommy said, adjusting reading glasses to examine flood control maps. Every house violates federal regulations that predate color television. No FEMA notification, no environmental impact study, no federal clearance. The entire development is illegal under laws older than NASA. His engineering assessment was clinically devastating. Creek bed analysis revealed a century of seasonal flooding patterns carved into the landscape like geological scripture. Water released from our dam would follow those natural channels with the precision of divine justice aimed directly at suburban hubris. Dramatic flooding but temporary, Tommy explained, tracing water paths on topographical maps. Maximum 8-foot depth through the construction zone, complete drainage within 1 week. Total property loss but no permanent environmental damage. The timing was perfect and horrifying. Construction was 85% complete, maximum financial investment, minimal human risk. But the first families were scheduled to move in May 25th, just 48 hours after federal regulations required flood control release. I called investigative journalist Rebecca Morrison, explaining federal jurisdiction implications that extended far beyond my personal land dispute. Her excitement crackled through phone static like electrical current. Ezra, Sunset Meadows could trigger nationwide enforcement of floodplain regulations. We're documenting systematic federal law violations across multiple states. Federal investigators stood ready with sealed warrants. Environmental groups prepared legal challenges. Media positioned for what could become the year's defining environmental story. But Memorial Day weekend approached with the inevitability of spring snowmelt and federal mandate. In 18 days, those dam gates would open for the first time in 80 years. Whether they released justice or just water would depend on timing, courage, and the ancient truth that water always finds its proper level. May 7th through 21st, 14 days to orchestrate the most elaborate environmental justice operation in Colorado history, assuming justice and revenge could be distinguished through paperwork. My kitchen table transformed into mission control headquarters, buried under engineering blueprints, federal regulations, topographical maps, and enough coffee-stained legal documents to build a small government bureaucracy. Morning light streaming through windows carried the sweet scent of spring snowmelt mixing with the metallic tang of approaching storms, both meteorological and judicial. Tommy McGrath materialized every sunrise armed with engineering tools and the methodical patience of someone who'd spent 4 decades making complicated machinery behave properly. We started with the dam's guts, 80 years of mountain weather, bureaucratic neglect, and manual operation that hadn't been tested since Truman was dropping atomic bombs on people who probably deserved it less than Vivian. Original 1940s counterbalance system, Tommy explained, examining steel pins corroded into abstract art sculptures. Gravity-fed operation, no electricity required. Remove these pins, water pressure handles the heavy lifting like God intended. The engineering was Depression-era beautiful. Robust federal design built by people who understood that water doesn't negotiate with politicians or wait for convenient scheduling. But 8 decades of Colorado weather had transformed precision machinery into an archaeological dig, requiring careful restoration and liberal applications of prayer. We worked in stages that would have horrified OSHA inspectors but satisfied federal operational requirements, replacing corroded components with hardware store alternatives while Tommy provided running commentary that could have educated sailors about creative profanity. The smell of penetrating oil cutting through rust layers mixed with his artistic cursing every time a bolt disintegrated, or measurements refused to match specifications drawn when Roosevelt was still walking. Modern parts, vintage engineering, he muttered, installing replacement hardware that would control several million gallons of accumulated snowmelt. Like installing Wi-Fi in a covered wagon, functional but philosophically disturbing. During our mechanical archaeology project, Della assembled our intelligence network with organizational skills that made her Pine Ridge Elementary's most feared administrator. She coordinated between Rebecca Morrison's media team, federal environmental attorneys, and a growing underground network of locals who'd finally recognized systematic corruption disguised as community development. Morrison positioned camera crews for what she termed the environmental David versus Goliath story of the decade. National media outlets were quietly deploying correspondents for Memorial Day coverage that would extend far beyond regional interest into federal policy implications affecting water rights across the western United States. We're documenting federal environmental authority reasserting itself over local political corruption, Morrison explained during clandestine meetings at Rusty's Diner, where the smell of bacon grease mixed with conspiracy theories and justified paranoia. This triggers investigations in 12 states where similar violations are systematically ignored. The legal foundation was titanium solid. Federal attorneys had reviewed 1943 documentation and confirmed absolute authority for seasonal flood releases that superseded local zoning like constitutional amendments override city ordinances. Environmental groups prepared simultaneous lawsuits challenging every comparable development west of the Mississippi River. But timing demanded precision that would have impressed Apollo mission planners. Peak snowmelt conditions, May 23rd. Construction completion, May 24th. Family move-ins beginning, May 25th. Federal water management requirements that couldn't be delayed, postponed, or negotiated with weather patterns, construction schedules, or suburban sensibilities. The moral mathematics tortured my sleep, wrestling with choices affecting dozens of innocent families who'd trusted lawyers, realtors, and government officials to protect their investments. Destroy empty houses or watch people lose life savings on condemned properties. Property damage versus human financial devastation. Every option involved suffering. The variables were distribution and timing. Safety preparations consumed our final week with obsessive attention to preventing human casualties during what would officially register as routine federal flood control management. Emergency equipment positioned throughout the impact zone, warning signs, first aid stations, communication systems. Remote cameras installed to document water flow and ensure no breathing humans occupied the danger zone. Tommy's motion sensor network, connected through electronic wizardry to his smartphone, would alert us instantly if anyone wandered into harm's way. "Won't stop the water," he explained, testing detection systems. "But we'll know if someone needs rescuing from their own stupidity." Weather forecasts provided divine cooperation. 3 days of clear skies beginning May 23rd. Perfect conditions for maximum visual documentation and rapid drainage. Spring storms would clear Tuesday morning, leaving ideal circumstances for what meteorologists would record as seasonal flood management following standard federal environmental protocols. May 21st evening, standing beside restored dam controls with Tommy, I could feel accumulated snowmelt pressing against concrete and steel like natural forces gathering for inevitable collision with suburban hubris. The sound of rushing water mixed with wind through pine trees, creating mountain symphony that would soon meet development in confrontation that had been building since surveyors first drove stakes into stolen ground. Federal requirements satisfied, safety protocols implemented, documentation systems operational, Tommy announced, testing manual controls. All we need is courage and perfect timing. The floodgates were ready. Federal authority was prepared to remind everyone that some laws predate corruption. In 48 hours, water would find its level and justice would flow downhill toward truth. May 15th, Vivian crossed the line from suburban dictator to full-blown surveillance state commander with a paranoia complex and unlimited legal budget. Black SUVs materialized overnight like mechanical tumors. Private security vehicles with Denver plates and the kind of tinted windows that scream, "We're watching you," in 14 languages. Off-duty cops turned corporate mercenaries positioned themselves around my property with all the subtlety of military occupation forces, creating an atmosphere that smelled like diesel exhaust mixed with constitutional violations. The helicopter surveillance began Tuesday, circling every 2 hours like a mechanical vulture checking for signs of weakness. Not the sheriff's bird, which I'd recognize from cattle roundups, but some private aviation outfit whose rotor wash kicked up dust that tasted like fear and felt like living in a police state disguised as community protection. My morning coffee ritual became an exercise in psychological endurance, sitting on my own porch while telephoto lenses tracked my movements like I was planning to overthrow the government instead of drinking Maxwell House, and wondering what my grandfather would have done to people who turned America into East Germany with HOA bylaws. The bureaucratic harassment reached comic opera levels of absurdity. Anonymous complaints triggered daily wellness checks by sheriff's deputies who looked like they'd rather be investigating actual crimes instead of determining whether a rancher constituted a threat to suburban tranquility. "Ezra, I'm sorry," Deputy Kane said, approaching with the enthusiasm of a man attending his own funeral. "Got another report you're stockpiling explosives and conducting surveillance on families." "What am I supposedly surveilling them with, Kane? Binoculars made from toilet paper tubes, my dangerous cattle with their threatening mooing?" "Report claims you've been seen with suspicious engineering equipment and coordinating with known agitators." He gestured helplessly at paperwork that could have been fiction except for the official letterhead. "I know it's complete horseshit, but the forms have to be filed." The financial warfare escalated into systematic economic strangulation designed to force surrender through bankruptcy. Emergency court order froze my accounts based on Vivian's sworn testimony that I was financing domestic terrorism through agricultural resources and water management infrastructure. Apparently, owning a federally constructed dam had become evidence of criminal conspiracy in Judge Caldwell's parallel universe of jurisprudence. Couldn't buy cattle feed. Couldn't purchase equipment fuel. Couldn't access my own money without court approval that would arrive sometime after the heat death of the universe. Local businesses were terrified to accept cash payments, afraid of being accused of enabling terrorist financing by someone whose legal bills exceeded most people's mortgage payments. The midnight sabotage campaign escalated from psychological to mechanical warfare with surgical precision that revealed intimate knowledge of ranch operations. Tires slashed on equipment positioned where replacements would be impossible to install quickly. Sugar dissolved in gas tanks to create engine failure that would appear mechanical rather than malicious. Fence lines cut strategically to allow cattle onto county roads where they'd become traffic hazards and lawsuit opportunities. Della's car windows were smashed in the school parking lot while she taught multiplication tables to children whose parents believed she was related to an environmental terrorist. The message crystallized like mountain air. No Whitmore family member was safe from consequences of refusing suburban surrender. But desperation was cracking Vivian's perfect facade like spring ice under pressure. Helena Cortez had become our secret intelligence asset through what she termed elderly invisibility operations. At 73, Helena possessed the camouflage that comes with advanced age and the cunning acquired through surviving decades of bureaucratic predators. Attended last night's emergency HOA meeting, Helena reported during coffee that smelled like cinnamon conspiracy and tasted like justified revenge. Vivian's completely unhinged, ranting about political campaigns, statewide expansion, transforming Colorado into her personal planned community empire. The real intelligence gold was financial. Helena had somehow acquired bank documents revealing the economic desperation driving Vivian's escalating behavior. Preston's construction company had borrowed against projected sales to fund development, creating compound interest obligations that would destroy both business and personal assets if the project failed. They're mortgaged beyond mathematical possibility, Helena explained, producing paperwork through methods I chose not to examine. Every delay costs them exponentially. If Sunset Meadows collapses, they lose houses, investments, probably their marriage. This stopped being about ego weeks ago. Now it's pure financial survival. The revelation transformed my understanding of enemy psychology. Vivian wasn't fighting for community development or environmental protection. She was fighting to prevent personal bankruptcy, which made her infinitely more dangerous and more likely to make fatal errors under pressure. May 20th delivered news that Rebecca Morrison's investigation had triggered federal law enforcement attention extending far beyond environmental violations. FBI Financial Crimes Division was quietly examining bank records, construction permits, and political networks, suggesting systematic corruption spanning multiple counties and involving elected officials whose names would make headlines. Standing on my porch that evening, security lights sweeping stolen pasture like prison searchlights hunting escaped dignity, I could taste approaching climax mixing with ozone from electrical storms gathering beyond mountain peaks. Vivian had declared total war against federal authority disguised as one stubborn rancher who remembered when America meant something different than surveillance states run by suburban dictators. In 72 hours, she'd learned that some wars can't be won with money, surveillance, or lawyers who bill by the constitutional violation. May 20th, Vivian launched her nuclear option with the desperation of someone whose empire was built on quicksand and borrowed time. The emergency pre-Memorial Day home sale event materialized overnight with the marketing sophistication of a presidential campaign and the moral flexibility of a payday loan operation. Professional banners appeared along Highway 34 advertising patriotic family discounts and honor our heroes housing. The smell of fresh ink on glossy brochures mixed with the diesel exhaust from media trucks covering what Vivian had branded as Pine Ridge Falls' contribution to American homeownership dreams. But the target demographics revealed her true desperation. Military families from Fort Carson, elderly couples on fixed incomes, young parents with maxed-out credit cards, every vulnerable population that could be manipulated through patriotic language and predatory financing. The sales pitches were masterpieces of emotional manipulation wrapped in red, white, and blue packaging. These homes represent the American dream. Vivian announced to Channel 7's cameras, standing before a Support Our Troops banner while wearing a flag pin the size of a bottle cap. Affordable housing for the families who've served our country and deserve our gratitude. The financing terms were criminal: adjustable rate mortgages that would double within 3 years, hidden fees that added 20% to purchase prices, and closing costs that would bankrupt families who discovered too late they'd signed contracts for condemned properties. But the emotional hooks were perfectly calibrated to bypass rational financial analysis. Honor your service with homeownership, the brochures promised. Veterans deserve stability, and Sunset Meadows delivers the security your family earned. Judge Caldwell delivered the legal coup de grace during another emergency session that lasted exactly 17 minutes, just long enough to rubber stamp Vivian's latest assault on constitutional property rights. Emergency eminent domain proceedings requiring ranch sale within 48 hours for public safety and community development. The court finds immediate necessity for resolution of this environmental hazard, Caldwell announced without making eye contact, reading from prepared text like a hostage video. The Whitmore property will be seized for public good effective Memorial Day morning. The eviction was scheduled for May 25th, my grandfather's birthday, when he would have turned 97 if cancer hadn't claimed him in 98. The symbolism was deliberate cruelty designed to break whatever spirit I might have left after months of systematic persecution. But Vivian's desperation had created the opening I'd been waiting for. Her accelerated timeline meant families would start moving in exactly 48 hours after the federally mandated flood control release. The moral calculation that had tortured my sleep for weeks suddenly crystallized into perfect clarity. I could destroy empty houses and save innocent families from financial ruin, or I could allow those families to move into properties that federal law would condemn within months. Property damage versus human devastation. The choice had been made by federal regulations written in 1943 by people who understood that water doesn't negotiate with real estate schedules. May 22nd brought the final piece of intelligence that sealed Vivian's fate. Rebecca Morrison's investigation had uncovered insurance fraud that extended far beyond construction violations. Every home sale included policies that specifically excluded acts of nature and federal water management activities, meaning buyers would receive zero compensation for flood damage caused by routine dam operations. "She's selling flood insurance that doesn't cover floods," Morrison explained during our final coordination call. "Federal investigators have enough evidence for criminal conspiracy charges that could put both Ashfords in federal prison for 15 years. The FBI was positioned to move immediately after the flood, using property destruction as evidence of systematic fraud rather than natural disaster. Environmental groups had lawsuits prepared challenging similar developments nationwide. Media outlets were coordinating simultaneous coverage that would make Sunset Meadows the symbol of environmental justice, reasserting federal authority over local corruption. But timing remained critical beyond mathematical precision. Peak snowmelt conditions on May 23rd. Federal requirements for water release during optimal weather conditions. Construction completion that afternoon. Family move-ins beginning May 25th at exactly 10 a.m., 2 hours after the water would recede to normal levels. Standing beside the dam controls with Tommy that evening, testing manual release mechanisms one final time, I could feel the weight of accumulated snowmelt pressing against concrete like natural forces gathering for inevitable collision with suburban hubris. The sound of rushing water mixed with evening wind through pine trees, creating mountain symphony that would soon meet development in confrontation that had been building since surveyors first violated federal floodplain regulations. "Everything's synchronized," Tommy announced, checking motion sensors and safety protocols. "Weather conditions optimal, documentation systems operational, emergency response positioned, federal water management requirements satisfied." May 23rd would begin with dawn breaking over Pine Ridge Falls and water finding its natural level according to laws older than Vivian's ambition and more permanent than her corruption. Tomorrow, federal authority would remind everyone that some principles can't be purchased, some laws can't be corrupted, and some justice flows downhill with the inevitability of spring snowmelt seeking its ancient pathways to truth. The floodgates were ready to open. The reckoning was ready to begin. May 23rd, 5:47 a.m. I removed the steel pins from an 80-year-old dam and watched federal authority reassert itself through several million gallons of crystal-clear justice. The morning air was crisp enough to see your breath, carrying the pine scent of mountain snowmelt and the metallic taste of anticipation that comes right before everything changes forever. Tommy stood beside me at the manual controls, both of us wearing the expression of men about to make history or commit the most elaborate act of environmental theater in Colorado's recorded past. Federal flood control requirements, I said, pulling the first pin. Seasonal water management, Tommy replied, removing the second pin. Routine dam operations, we said together, releasing the third pin that had held back justice for 6 months and 43 days. The sound started as a rumble like distant thunder, building to a roar that could be heard 3 counties away as 10 feet of accumulated snowmelt crashed through the spillway with the enthusiasm of water that had been waiting 80 years for this exact moment. The ground vibrated like artillery fire, except this artillery was aimed at suburban corruption and loaded with federal environmental law. The water hit the construction zone at 6:03 a.m. with the precision of divine intervention guided by hydraulic engineering. Brown Creek water carrying the honest smell of wet earth and decomposed leaves rolled through Sunset Meadows like nature's own repo man, swallowing Tesla charging stations and pristine mailboxes with the efficiency of entropy applied to real estate fraud. Rebecca Morrison's camera crews, positioned since dawn at strategic vantage points, captured HD footage of luxury homes becoming temporary islands in an ocean of environmental justice. The visual impact was everything we'd calculated, dramatic enough for national news coverage, temporary enough to avoid permanent ecological damage, and perfectly timed to occur during routine federal water management operations. Vivian arrived at 6:23 a.m. in her white Tesla, now sporting several inches of creek water around the wheels like a very expensive boat designed by people who'd never seen actual water. Her expression progressed through denial, rage, and finally comprehension as she realized she was witnessing the systematic destruction of everything she'd stolen through 6 months of legal warfare. "This is sabotage!" she screamed at anyone within hearing range, including Morrison's cameras and the gathering crowd of residents who'd come to witness either natural disaster or divine retribution. "That maniac destroyed our community." But her accusations died in the mountain air like smoke from a fire that had burned out months ago. Emergency response vehicles were already positioned, not for rescue operations but for documentation purposes. Federal investigators had arrived before the water, armed with sealed warrants and decades of environmental law that made this flood as legal as sunrise and twice as inevitable. The emergency town meeting convened that evening in the community center, packed beyond fire code capacity with residents, media representatives, federal agents, and the kind of crowd that gathers when corruption finally meets consequences in broad daylight. The air was thick with the smell of wet concrete, righteous indignation, and the ozone scent of political storms that had been building since March. Vivian attempted damage control from the podium like a general trying to explain how victory had somehow turned into unconditional surrender. "We've suffered an unprecedented natural disaster that no one could have predicted," she began, reading from notes that kept getting soggy from her sweating hands. "Unprecedented?" I stood up from the back of the room, holding the 1943 Army Corps manual like constitutional scripture. Or exactly what federal engineers predicted when they built flood control systems to prevent this exact scenario. The crowd noise died to library silence as I walked toward the front, Tommy beside me carrying topographical maps that showed 80 years of seasonal flooding patterns. Della followed with copies of federal documentation that established water management authority predating Colorado statehood. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, reaching the microphone with the calm that comes from having federal law on your side, "meet the Willow Creek Federal Flood Control System, built in 1943, operated under Army Corps authority, and functioning exactly as designed for seasonal water management." I opened the manual to page 32. Federal regulations require dam operators to release excess water during peak snowmelt conditions to prevent catastrophic downstream flooding. We followed the law, every single regulation, every safety protocol, every environmental requirement. The silence stretched like taffy until someone in the crowd started clapping, then another. Then the entire room erupted in applause that sounded like vindication mixed with relief and seasoned with the kind of justice that only comes when David's slingshot finds its mark. "Water doesn't read HOA bylaws, ma'am," I said, looking directly at Vivian, "but it follows federal law perfectly." FBI agents stepped forward with handcuffs that gleamed like jewelry in the fluorescent lights. Federal charges, conspiracy, bank fraud, environmental violations, and systematic corruption that would make headlines from Denver to Washington. The flood had lasted 6 hours. The justice would last considerably longer. 1 year later, federal justice flows slower than spring snowmelt, but it eventually reaches its destination with the persistence of water seeking its level. Vivian Ashford Cross received 18 months in federal prison, though she'd probably describe her accommodations as substandard housing with inadequate community amenities. Preston drew 24 months for construction fraud, bank conspiracy, and what federal prosecutors called systematic environmental terrorism disguised as community development. Judge Caldwell was disbarred faster than a crooked lawyer in an honest town, which Pine Ridge Falls was slowly becoming again. The financial restitution exceeded everyone's expectations except Helena Cortez, who'd predicted exactly $2.3 million in recovered assets from seized HOA accounts and Preston's liquidated construction equipment. "Corrupt people always overestimate their cleverness," she explained over coffee that tasted like vindication mixed with cinnamon. "They steal so much they forget to hide it properly." My family recovered more than money. The original 340 acres were restored through federal environmental protection programs that recognize the ranch as critical watershed habitat deserving permanent conservation status. The Army Corps upgraded our dam system with modern safety equipment while maintaining its historical designation as a federal flood control facility. But the real victory was community healing that started the morning after the flood and spread like good news through mountain valleys that had forgotten what justice smelled like. Rusty's Diner became an unofficial museum displaying newspaper clippings, federal documents, and photos of the great flood of environmental justice that had made Pine Ridge Falls famous for something other than suburban corruption. "Best damn cup of coffee in Colorado," Pete Kowalski announced, serving Whitmore beef to customers who lined up for the chance to eat at the place where David had planned his assault on Goliath. "And the only diner in America where environmental justice comes with hash browns." The Whitmore Water Education Center opened 6 months later in partnership with Colorado State University, occupying buildings where 57 illegal homes had briefly stood like monuments to human arrogance. The smell of fresh lumber mixed with mountain air and the sound of children learning about watershed management replaced the diesel exhaust of corruption with something that smelled like hope. Della's scholarship program enrolled its first class of environmental law students, young people who'd learned that federal water rights can override local politics when applied with sufficient patience and precise timing. "Water law," she told her students, "is like teaching 3rd grade. You have to be smarter than your opposition and more patient than they are corrupt." Tommy McGrath started a consulting business specializing in historical dam restoration, traveling across the western states to help communities rediscover federal water management authority they'd forgotten existed. "Amazing how many 1940s flood control systems are still operational," he'd tell clients, "once you remove 80 years of bureaucratic rust." Rebecca Morrison won the Environmental Journalism Award for her investigation that triggered federal enforcement actions in 47 similar cases across 12 states. Her series, When Waters Rise, Federal Authority versus Local Corruption, became required reading in journalism schools and environmental law courses nationwide. The restored land became Pine Ridge Falls' crown jewel, 340 acres of protected wetland habitat where native wildlife returned like old friends to a familiar neighborhood. The annual Willow Creek Environmental Festival draws thousands of visitors who come to see where environmental justice met suburban development in collision that reminded America what federal authority looks like when properly applied. "Sometimes patience isn't weakness," I tell school groups who visit the education center, standing beside the dam where it all began. "Sometimes patience is strategy, and sometimes the best revenge is letting nature take its course according to laws older than the people trying to break them." The practical lessons spread far beyond our mountain valley. Always research federal flood maps before buying property near water. Historical water rights often supersede modern zoning laws, and documentation defeats corruption when applied with sufficient persistence and federal backing. But the deepest satisfaction comes on quiet mornings when I sit on my porch with coffee that tastes like home, watching sunrise paint the Rockies while listening to Willow Creek running clear and free through land that belongs to the family that's worked it for 4 generations. The water still flows downhill, truth still seeks its level, and justice, when properly channeled through federal environmental law, can move mountains or at least remove the corrupt suburban developments built illegally in their shadow.